Over the past few years, there has been a very clear trend when it comes to roster changes in Pro League teams. More often than not, it seems to be the support players that are getting the boot. And a lot of the time, these support players are not being replaced by other support players, but rather by flex players or even fraggers. One of the most notable examples of this is probably the evolution of G2. Over the course of the past few seasons, they dropped Jonas, Goga and Fabian to replace them with Virtue, Citizen and Uno. Now, I'm not trying to say that the former three are bad players, but it's not really controversial to say that Virtue, Citizen and Uno bring way more firepower to the table. And it seems like G2 is not the only team who went through that kind of a direction. So the question is this actually a general trend? And if yes, why is it that support players are becoming an endangered species? But before we get into that, I want to talk about the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark VPN. As the name suggests, Surfshark is a VPN provider, and those allow you to have more control over your internet traffic. Why would you want to do that? Well, that depends on what kind of a person you are. If you care about privacy and security, you can use Surfshark to hide your IP address as you are browsing, which stops companies from tracking and selling your info. And while you are connected to one of Surfshark's VPNs, they don't collect any of your data. If you care about watching shows on streaming platforms, using Surfshark allows you to get access to all the different country libraries, just by switching the server you're currently connected to. I personally use it to watch Criminal Minds on Netflix, because that show is simply not available in Germany. If you want to give Surfshark a try, there is a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's really not much risk involved. And on top of that, you can go to the link in the description and use code REAPER to get 83% off, plus an additional 3 months for free. So thanks again to Surfshark, and let's get on with the video. So our hypothesis consists of two parts. A, support players are more likely to get dropped compared to flex or fraggers. And B, those dropped supports are then replaced by players with more firepower, meaning flex or fraggers. So let's start with answering the first part, and because I'm a man of science, we're going to make use of actual data. What you see here is a list of all the roster changes from EU and NA Pro League teams that happened in the last 2 years. For every player, I recorded the stats of the Pro League season right before he was dropped, and based on his most played operator and an eye test, I categorized everyone into support, flex or fragger, and then I did the same for their replacement. And sure, these are somewhat broad categories, and some of the classifications I made are definitely debatable, but you're going to see that it doesn't really matter in the bigger picture. Alright, so what do the stats tell us? First of all, we have to clean this up a bit. Disrupt, for example, didn't really drop NJR, right? He just got a better offer from Dark Zero. So going forward, I'm only going to consider intentional roster moves. That brings us down to 53 changes. And now, it's time for the grand reveal. Out of those 53 players that were dropped, 35 of them, so almost 2/3, were support players. And if you consider that in an average team, support players make up only 1/3 of all the players, we can definitely confirm the first part of the hypothesis. Support players really are being dropped more often than flex and fraggers. And now for the second part. Who is replacing those dropped support players? For that number, I included every roster change in which a support player was replaced by a flex, or a flex was replaced by a fragger, which is supposed to be a proxy for an upgrade in firepower. Summing all those changes up, we get that out of the 53 changes, 33, so again almost 2/3, came with an upgrade in firepower. And that confirms the second part of the hypothesis. Pro League teams really are replacing their support players with flex and fraggers. So turns out that this is actually an observable trend. But the question remains, why are Pro League teams doing that? Are support players just not needed anymore? The answer to that is a resounding no. Because when a team drops their hard support to bring on a fragger, they don't just suddenly play without thermite and smoke. All of them still run support operators. They just have one of their former flex players take on the role of new support. And I think here lies the key to understanding this concept. What changes when you drop a native support player and put a native flex player on Thermite and Smoke? Presumably, you lose something in the communication, droning, and teamplay department, because that's where native support players should shine. But what do you get in return? The answer is fairly simple. You get more firepower. And that's the secret. Over time, more and more pro league teams have realized that firepower and being able to win 1v1 gunfights is way more important than they previously thought. In my video about why KD matters, I extensively talked about why being able to get kills is so important in pro league games. Link is in the description if you want to check it out. The main takeaway of that video is that no amount of support play will eliminate the need to win gunfights. So if gunfights are inevitable, you'd rather have more firepower. And traditionally, that's something that native support players just don't have. That exact story is also told by the numbers. If we look at the stats of supports that were dropped, we're going to notice that pretty much all of them have KDs of below 1.0. Now, I'm not trying to say that all of them were dropped because of their KD, but you can't deny that there's a trend here. Apparently, it's not enough to be just a support in this day and age. If you want job security, you either have to be able to carry your own weight, like Bride or Bosco, or you need to be a top-class in-game leader, like Canadian. If you're just a good support player, I'm afraid your skill set just isn't compatible with the modern interpretation of how Siege is meant to be played. I mean, just think about it. The metas we've seen in the past 2 years have been the most utility-focused metas in the history of Rainbow. So, if anything, you would expect teams to bring on more native support players, who are presumably smarter when it comes to utility usage. But that didn't happen. Instead, we got more and more fraggers. And this just proves that teams have shifted their priorities. Classic support characteristics have lost importance, while firepower and individual skill have gained importance. So that's one possible explanation. Pros gaining a more thorough understanding of how the game is meant to be played, and then making changes accordingly. But there are also a few more practical reasons for why support players are being replaced by fraggers. Think about the kind of skills that you need in order to be a good fragger, for example. Most of them are mechanical or instinctual in nature, right? Things like aim or reaction speed. The skills of a support player, however, are more mental in nature. It's things like awareness, communication, or foresight. And the biggest difference between them is that you can't really learn the skill set of a fragger. We rarely see pros improve their mechanics past the age of 23, for example. The skills on the mental side, however, can very well be improved. If you spend time on a pro league team, you are automatically going to pick up skills such as droning, communication, or shot calling. In fact, I would argue that every pro league player, who's been there for more than 2 years, has the necessary skill set to be a support. And if we assume that to be true, it suddenly makes a lot of sense why teams are fine with putting one of their veteran flex players on hard support. Adding on to that point, this evolution from fragger to flex to support is also just a very natural progression for a player, right? The best example for that is probably Canadian, who started out playing Ash and Jaeger for EG, but then as time went on, he became a hard support for SSG. Now, I don't know how much of that was due to his mechanics getting worse or due to his support skills getting better, but in either case, we're definitely going to see more players like him in the future. So in a way, dropping old support players in order to bring on young fraggers is kind of just a circle of life in Rainbow. Editing Reaper here. As you might be able to tell, I recorded the audio before Canadian announced his retirement. I just wanted to provide some context because that last sentence was kind of morbid without it. Okay, so now we covered the what and the why, but one question remains. Does this actually work out for teams? The problem is that this is kind of a difficult question to answer, because this trend of replacing supports can be observed in pretty much every team. And if every team is doing it, you can't really say how much of an effect it had, because we don't really have a reference group. Using the stats that I have here, I can tell you that in the Pro League season right after the roster change, teams didn't really improve their standings. So basically there is no effect. But if we're allowed to do some cherry picking, then I've got a few pretty nice examples for you. Hyper replacing Jarvis on Dark Zero, for example. Or in the same season, Fultz replacing Brian on SSG. Or just one season later, Gio replacing Bio on TSM. All of these teams went on to be very successful, and I don't think that any of them regret getting rid of their support players. In fact, it looks like Dark Zero is doubling down on the strategy with their move to replace Hot and Cold with NJR, which I think is very reminiscent of the Hyper move. But of course there are also examples of this not working out as intended. G2 for example, when they dropped Goga to get Cryan, just to end up having to put him on Heartbreach because the whole system didn't work out. And I guess something similar can be said about Na'Vi, who decided to drop 2 support/flex players in Nello and Panix to bring in 2 flex/fraggers in Blur and Joe. But the Na'Vi case is actually really interesting, because in the current transfer period, they dropped Joe and Kandrew and brought on 2 true support players in Secretly and Nathan. So it kind of looks like they're going back to the roots with more support players on the team. And something very similar is happening in NA with Mirage. They had the freedom to build an entirely new team and intentionally decided to build it around support players. In fact, their coach even said that traditional supports are undervalued right now, which kind of goes in the opposite direction of what everyone else is saying. So it looks like there are at least some teams who don't fully buy into that idea of replacing support players. And because of that, I think the upcoming Pro League season is going to be super interesting. In EU, we have Na'Vi, who brought on 2 new support players, going up against Secret, who dropped 2 of their support players in order to bring in more firepower. And in NA, we have Oxygen, who also dropped 2 support players to bring in more fraggers, against Mirage, who pretty much built their team around support players. So I'm very interested to see how that's going to turn out. Ultimately, I think it's important to strike a balance. Generally, I do agree with the philosophy behind replacing support players. I think the times where it was fine for your supports to consistently go negative are kind of over now. But at the same time, it is kind of risky to drop your entire support backbone all at once. I think the best way to go about it is to slowly phase out your support players without messing up the identity of the team. Alright, that's pretty much it. I hope this video gave you a better understanding of the philosophy that is behind this recent trend of roster changes. And yes, what you saw in the beginning was actually a paid sponsorship. And because I crossed that line, I might as well ask you to like the video and to subscribe to my channel. Because if this video turns out to be popular, I'll be in a better position to negotiate my next sponsorship. That's how the business works. So I hope that you understand. I hope that you enjoyed the video, and I hope that you learned something new. Thanks for watching.